The collapse nobody saw coming. Look, I want you to pay close attention, because what's unfolding right now isn't just another business story or another headline about electric cars. Something bigger is happening, and most people still haven't connected the dots. Here's the number that started this entire investigation: 63%. That's how much Tesla's vehicle sales in Canada dropped in just 1 year. Not a slowdown, not a seasonal dip, not inflation pressure, a collapse. In early 2025, Tesla was selling around 55,000 vehicles annually in Canada. By the end of the year, sales had fallen to roughly 20,000 units. That means more than 35,000 potential buyers simply walked away. And what makes this more serious is that these customers didn't postpone purchases. They didn't switch to cheaper Teslas. They didn't wait for upgrades. They left the brand, and many of them aren't coming back. At first glance, you might think this is about competition. Maybe newer models from rivals. Maybe pricing pressure. Maybe supply issues. But when you look at the broader market, that explanation falls apart. Because during the same period, the overall electric vehicle market didn't shrink. It grew. In Europe, for example, electric vehicle registrations rose by roughly 27%. Demand for EVs was increasing. Governments were still pushing electrification. Consumers were still buying electric cars. Yet Tesla's numbers were heading in the opposite direction. In France, Tesla sales fell around 37%. In Germany, nearly half of Tesla's sales disappeared, with registrations down close to 48% year over year. Let that sink in. The market was expanding while Tesla was shrinking. That's not competition. That's rejection. When analysts dug into registration data across Europe between January and November 2025, Tesla registrations fell from about 326,000 vehicles to roughly 235,000. Nearly 91,000 fewer cars on European roads compared to the previous period. Meanwhile, total battery electric vehicle registrations in Europe crossed 2.2 million units. So the market didn't abandon EVs. It abandoned Tesla, and the consequences showed up in market share numbers. Just 2 years earlier, Tesla controlled over 18% of Europe's EV market. By early 2025, that number had dropped to around 9%. In other words, Tesla lost almost half its market dominance in record time. And while this was happening, another company quietly stepped into the spotlight. BYD, the Chinese electric vehicle manufacturer, overtook Tesla in global EV sales. Not just domestically, globally. BYD sold more than 2 million electric vehicles, surpassing Tesla's global deliveries and ending Tesla's long reign as the world's largest EV seller. For over a decade, Tesla symbolized the future of transportation. Suddenly, it wasn't leading anymore. But the real turning point didn't happen in Europe or China. It happened in Canada. Because Canada showed something important. This wasn't just a market shift. It was emotional. In Quebec, one of the strongest EV markets in North America, Tesla sales dropped by an astonishing 85% in early 2025. 85%. Buyers weren't just choosing alternatives quietly. They were actively moving away from Tesla. And competitors stepped in fast. General Motors ended up becoming the top EV seller in Canada, pushing Tesla into second place in a country where Tesla once dominated. So the question becomes unavoidable. What actually happened? Why would a market leader suddenly lose customers across multiple countries at the same time, while demand for electric vehicles continues growing? At first, analysts blamed product cycles, then competition, then price wars. But none of those explanations fully matched the timing. Because something else was happening in the background, something political, cultural, and emotional. And almost nobody wanted to say it out loud. Early in 2025, Tesla's leadership became directly involved in political events and controversies that spread far beyond the United States. Statements, endorsements, and online conflicts started dominating headlines across Canada and Europe. And many consumers didn't see those actions as neutral political opinions. They saw them as personal attacks on their countries and their political systems. In Canada, public statements triggered backlash among politicians and consumers alike. In parts of Europe, political endorsements sparked protests and criticism. Suddenly, buying a Tesla didn't feel like just buying a car anymore. For many customers, it felt like making a political statement. And here's the key detail most people missed. There was no organized boycott. No massive protest movement telling people what to do. Consumers simply stopped buying. Quietly, individually, wallet by wallet. And when trust disappears, sales disappear with it. But what shocked analysts even more is what happened next. Because the backlash didn't stop with cars, it spread beyond one company, beyond one industry, and eventually beyond one country. And when we follow the data, it leads to something even bigger, something that began affecting American tourism, international travel, and global economic relationships. And that's where this story takes a much darker turn. So before we go further, let me ask you something. Do you think this collapse was really about cars? Or was it about something much deeper? Because in part 2, we're going to look at how this controversy expanded beyond Tesla and started hitting something nobody expected, the entire American tourism industry. And that's where the financial damage exploded. When the backlash hit America itself, now here's where the story stops being about Tesla or even electric vehicles and starts becoming something much bigger. Because once consumers began pushing back against companies, the reaction didn't stop there. It spread to something nobody expected, how people felt about traveling to the United States itself. And the numbers are shocking. In 2025, the United States lost an estimated $30 billion in international tourism revenue. Not because of a recession, not because of a pandemic, not because flights were unavailable. People simply chose not to go. At first glance, a 6% drop in international arrivals might not sound catastrophic. But here's the part that changes everything. Global tourism was booming at the same time. Travel worldwide was recovering strongly. Europe was seeing record numbers. Asia was reopening. Vacation demand was exploding again. Everywhere was growing, except the United States. So analysts started asking the obvious question: who stopped coming? And the answer revealed something much deeper. Canadian visitors, traditionally the most loyal tourists to the US, sharply reduced travel south of the border. From January through October 2025, Canadian visits to the US dropped nearly 20% overall. In some months, overnight trips fell 26%, while car crossings dropped as much as 38%. Think about what that really means. For generations, Canadians drove across the border for weekend shopping, vacations in Florida, concerts, sporting events, family trips, and short getaways. Suddenly, those trips just stopped. But Canadians didn't stop traveling. They just stopped going to America. Domestic tourism inside Canada surged. Hotel occupancy rates climbed to their highest levels since before the pandemic. National parks, museums, and historical sites saw record attendance. Instead of flying to New York or Los Angeles, Canadians vacationed at home or chose Mexico, the Caribbean, or Europe, anywhere but the US. And while tourists simply changed destinations, small businesses in American border towns paid the price. Shop owners in states like Michigan, New York, and Washington began reporting double-digit declines in customer traffic. Some businesses saw Canadian customer numbers fall 70% to 80%. Gift shops, restaurants, wineries, hotels, many depended heavily on cross-border travelers. One small store owner near the border said Canadian customers normally made up around a quarter of annual revenue. In 2025, she could count Canadian visitors on one hand. Entire communities started feeling the ripple effects. And it wasn't just Canada. Travel patterns across Europe and Asia showed similar shifts. Travelers who once defaulted to American cities started choosing alternatives. European tourists booked trips to Canada instead of New York. Others picked Spain, France, or Italy. Asian travelers increasingly chose Australia or regional destinations instead of California. And then analysts uncovered another major factor. Travel to the US was becoming harder. Visa processing delays stretched longer than ever. In cities like Paris and Berlin, wait times reached 6 months. In some countries, including India and China, appointment waits stretched close to a year. Interview waivers became harder to qualify for, forcing more travelers into in-person appointments. Backlogs exploded. And then came discussions of new travel fees, proposals that would add hundreds of dollars in extra charges on top of existing visa costs. For many families, a trip to the United States suddenly became significantly more expensive before even buying plane tickets. And here's what really matters. This wasn't about organized protests. It was about perception. When travelers feel unwelcome or believe the process is too difficult or too expensive, they simply go somewhere else. And tourism is brutally competitive. Cities compete, countries compete, airlines compete, hotels compete. Lose trust once, and rebuilding it takes years. By mid 2025, Las Vegas, one of America's biggest tourism engines, saw visitor numbers fall more than 11% year over year in some months. Hotel occupancy in major cities softened. Tourism boards scrambled to understand why visitors were choosing other destinations. And the irony? American tourism jobs took the hit. Tourism supports roughly 9 million jobs across hotels, restaurants, attractions, airlines, and tour companies. When international tourists stop coming, workers feel it first. And international tourists spend more money than domestic ones. A European visitor might spend $3,000 in a week-long trip. A domestic tourist often spends far less. So even if Americans continue traveling within their own country, total tourism revenue still drops. But here's where things become even more interesting. While the US was losing tourists, Canada was gaining them. European and Asian travelers increasingly chose Canadian cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Canada marketed itself as welcoming, diverse, and easy to visit. And it worked. Instead of Canadians traveling south, more international tourists traveled north. The tourism equation flipped. And suddenly analysts began asking a larger question. Was this just about travel? Or was it about something deeper happening to America's global reputation? Because by late 2025, data showed something alarming. For the first time in years, the United States risked being the only major economy to lose international tourism revenue in a growing global travel market. And this shift didn't happen overnight. It built slowly through political disputes, trade tensions, visa difficulties, and global controversies. And then something else happened, something that pushed this story into an entirely new phase. Because while tourism and car sales were falling, a political earthquake was unfolding inside Washington itself. And the person at the center of Tesla's crisis suddenly found himself in the middle of a public political war. And that's where this story becomes even more unpredictable. Because in part 3, we're going to look at how political alliances collapsed, how Tesla's own loyal customers started leaving, and how competitors used the moment to take over global markets. And trust me, this is where the story turns explosive. When politics turned into a business crisis, now the story takes a turn almost nobody predicted. Up to this point, you could still argue that Tesla's struggles were temporary. Maybe competition caught up. Maybe product updates were delayed. Maybe economic pressure slowed demand. But what happened next proved something deeper was going wrong. Because while sales were falling across Europe and Canada, a political storm was brewing inside Washington, and it directly involved the most visible figure connected to Tesla. And once that conflict went public, the damage accelerated. By mid-2025, tensions between political leaders and powerful business figures who had once appeared closely aligned started breaking apart in full public view. It began with disagreements over major economic legislation. Social media posts escalated. Public criticism followed. Within days, political rallies included attacks and counterattacks. An alliance that once looked unbreakable suddenly collapsed. And markets hate uncertainty. But consumers hate controversy even more. Because now Tesla wasn't just caught in foreign political debates, it was trapped in domestic political warfare too. And the brand started paying the price. Internal consumer data showed something shocking about customer loyalty. Back in 2020, nearly 98% of Tesla owners who bought another EV chose Tesla again. That level of loyalty is almost unheard of in the auto industry. By 2025, that number dropped to around 78%. That means 1 out of every 5 Tesla owners switched to another brand when buying their next electric vehicle. Think about that. These weren't random customers. These were Tesla fans, people who already trusted the brand. And even they started leaving. Meanwhile, competition wasn't slowing down. In California, Tesla's home state and America's biggest EV market, Tesla's market share slipped noticeably within a single year, while competitors gained ground. And outside the US, rivals moved even faster. Chinese manufacturers, especially BYD, began flooding global markets with newer, cheaper models packed with features. In Germany and the United Kingdom, 2 of Tesla's key European markets, BYD sales surged dramatically year over year. The difference was simple. Tesla's main models, the Model 3 and Model Y were aging without major redesigns. Meanwhile, competitors were launching fresh models almost every quarter. Cheaper options, updated interiors, longer range, better tech packages. Tesla, once the disruptor, suddenly looked slow. And then another financial problem appeared. For years, Tesla earned large amounts of money selling regulatory credits to other automakers who failed to meet emission standards. But in 2025, regulatory changes and policy shifts weakened that revenue stream. Credit sales dropped significantly. At the same time, EV tax incentives in some markets were reduced or eliminated, making Tesla vehicles more expensive for consumers. Ironically, policies that were supposed to support domestic manufacturing ended up hurting one of America's most recognizable EV companies. And public perception kept getting worse. In Germany, protests erupted near Tesla's Berlin factory following political controversies. In the UK, lawmakers openly criticized perceived political interference. In Canada, petitions and public campaigns spread rapidly online. Suddenly, every headline became another reminder of controversy surrounding the company. And in branding, perception is reality. Once customers begin associating a brand with conflict, switching becomes easy. Competitors didn't need to attack Tesla. They simply offered alternatives. And buyers moved on. Meanwhile, Tesla's newest high-profile vehicle project failed to generate expected momentum. Production challenges and lower-than-expected demand meant it didn't offset, slowing sales elsewhere. So Tesla found itself squeezed from multiple directions. Aging product lineup, rising competition, reduced incentives, falling brand loyalty, political controversy, market share losses, all at the same time. And analysts began using a word that hadn't been associated with Tesla in years: disruption. But this time, Tesla wasn't causing disruption. It was experiencing it. And here's the part that should worry investors and policymakers alike. This situation wasn't just about one company. It showed how quickly political conflict can spill into consumer behavior, trade relationships, and global markets. Because once business and politics become intertwined, companies lose control of their brand narrative. And by late 2025, analysts started asking a dangerous question. What if this isn't temporary? What if this is a permanent shift? Because the consequences extend beyond Tesla, beyond EVs, and even beyond tourism. They reach into global trade relationships, alliances, and how consumers choose products in an increasingly connected world. And that leads us to the final part of this story. Because in part 4, we need to talk about where this is all heading, and whether this crisis marks the beginning of a long-term change in how global business works. And the answer might surprise you, where this all leads next. Now we get to the part everyone keeps asking about. Where does this go from here? Because what we've been watching isn't just the decline of one company or the fallout from one political controversy. It may be the first real sign that the relationship between global business and politics has fundamentally changed. And companies everywhere are still trying to figure out the new rules. Some analysts believe Tesla will recover. Forecasts suggest global sales could begin growing again in 2026, possibly reaching new highs later in the decade if new vehicle platforms succeed and demand continues rising worldwide. But those forecasts depend on two major assumptions. First, that brand perception improves. Second, that political controversies fade. Neither outcome is guaranteed. And the latest numbers show the challenge is still serious. In early 2025, Tesla's European sales fell sharply even as the overall EV market continued expanding at double-digit rates. Market share that once made Tesla dominant has been cut dramatically in just a few years. If that trend continues, Tesla risks becoming just another competitor in markets it once controlled. But here's the bigger issue, and this goes far beyond cars. For decades, multinational companies operated under a simple assumption: business and politics could remain separate. Sell products globally. Avoid controversy. Let governments handle politics. That assumption no longer holds. Consumers now connect brands with political behavior, leadership decisions, and national policies. Buying choices increasingly reflect personal values and political identity. If customers dislike a company's leadership stance, they walk away. If travelers feel unwelcome, they choose another destination. And once trust is damaged, rebuilding it takes years. The tourism example makes this clear. The U.S. tourism industry, worth trillions of dollars and supporting millions of jobs, is facing one of its toughest international challenges in decades. Visa delays, higher costs, and political tensions are discouraging visitors even as global travel hits record levels. And lost tourists rarely return quickly. They discover new destinations and build new travel habits. Meanwhile, competitors step in. Canada, Europe, and parts of Asia are making travel easier, promoting welcoming policies, and capturing travelers who once automatically chose the United States. And once market share moves, it rarely snaps back overnight. But the consequences aren't evenly distributed. Domestic tourism inside the US remains strong. Americans are still traveling. The difference is that domestic travelers typically spend less per trip than international visitors. So even when visitor numbers look stable, revenue declines. The volume remains. The spending doesn't. And the same pattern applies to manufacturing and trade. If companies lose international customers, factories slow, supply chains shrink, and jobs eventually feel pressure. Which brings us to the core question. Is this temporary turbulence or a structural shift? Because evidence suggests something deeper may be happening. Countries are diversifying trade partnerships. Regions are strengthening local economic ties. Companies are investing closer to home markets to avoid geopolitical risk. Globalization isn't disappearing, but it is changing. And the world seems less willing to separate politics from commerce than it was even 2 years ago. Which leaves us with an uncomfortable reality. Policies meant to strengthen domestic industries sometimes end up pushing away international customers. Trade barriers can reduce exports. Travel restrictions can reduce tourism revenue. Political conflict can damage brand trust. And repairing reputation takes far longer than losing it. So here's where we stand. Tesla may recover, or it may permanently lose some of its early advantage. Tourism flows may stabilize, or travelers may permanently prefer new destinations. But one thing is already clear. The world of 2025 operates differently from the world of 2023. Consumer choices now double as political signals. Companies are judged not only by products, but by behavior. And global reputation has become one of the most valuable and fragile business assets. So the final question isn't really about Tesla or tourism. It's this. Can global business adapt to a world where politics and commerce are permanently connected? Or are we about to watch this same pattern repeat across other industries and other countries? Because this story isn't finished. It's just beginning. And the decisions made over the next few years will determine whether this moment becomes a temporary crisis or the start of a new economic era. Now I want to hear your take. Do you think companies should stay out of politics completely? Or is that impossible in today's world? Either way, one thing is certain. The consequences of these shifts are only starting to unfold.